It does not play any creatures or any creature lands. It is going to win games only one way, and that way is slowly.
Yeah, one thing it has added with the most recent set is a copy of Seagate Wreckage, which will be interesting to see. We'll see if that one comes up.
Belfatto is less interested in slow games.
Yeah, no. He has 4 cards to start here, including a Mox Opal and one of them an Arcbound Ravager. We'll see the rest of his hand as Sam casts Inquisition of Kozilek. And a bit of a throwback, Michael has a copy of Arcbound Worker in his hand.
Yeah, it looks like there's 3 copies of Worker in the deck. He's also playing 3 Hangerback Walkers, so that modular ability actually plays quite well with Walker. You can move counters onto it, and that makes it larger, and it means it leaves more Thopters behind when it dies.
So Sam takes the Arcbound Worker, leaving Belfatto with just a pair of lands, and Arcbound Ravager will swing in for 1.
Yeah, and from the hand that we saw, Belfatto was keeping largely on the back of this Ravager. That was the payoff card for this hand, and now he really is going to rely on the top of his deck to give him more than a 1 point of damage, 1 point of damage a turn clock.
Yeah. Draw a mountain here for Sam. He does have a copy of Abrupt Decay in hand, so could deal with this Ravager. He'll lead off on Glimmervoid into Ancient Stirrings. Now, this means he's going to have to find an artifact.
The odds are quite high that he already has one, and the odds are also very high that he's going to hit. Ancient Stirrings is quietly one of the best cantrips, like quote-unquote cantrips in the format. Finds one that he can't cast, but sure is a good one in Ensnaring Bridge.
Yeah, this is part of the lock piece for Lantern Control. And now we do see Pyrite Spellbomb for Sam. That's the artifact so he can keep his Glimmervoid. He'll pass back the turn.
And Belfatto's really going to want to find some action spells. Looks like he has a Galvanic Blast in his hand. Sam is quite a bit out of burn rage at this point in time, and that Inkmoth Nexus is not helping Belfatto pressure his life total.
Second Darksteel Citadel for Belfatto.
So it actually looks like Galvanic Blast and Shrapnel Blast.
Oh, wow. So 9 points of burn.
So that's actually half of Sam's life total right now. So on this turn, I would be surprised if Belfatto didn't make some sacrifices to the Ravager, probably to get it out of that Pyrite Spellbomb range. I like sacrificing the Inkmoth Nexus and probably one of the Citadels, just get it up to 3. It's still weak to Abrupt Decay. You want to leave that Ornithopter hanging around for that reason.
Now, there is some concern here, right, that Sam can make Ensnaring Bridge next turn. Now, if Michael swings at the large Ravager this turn, and next turn he could swing Ornithopter and maybe throw some counters onto it, he gets damaged twice.
Yeah, you have to do some math on exactly how many cards Sam is going to have in his hand at the end of his next turn. You know, if he just plays land Ensnaring Bridge, he's only going -2 in addition to going up 1 in his draw step. It looks like Sam has 5 cards in hand right now, so you'd be able to attack with a 4-power creature on the next turn. And like we established with that 9 points of burn, he just needs to get a couple shots in to make these burn spells lethal.
So he decides to swing in for 2 with Arcbound Ravager and put 1 poison onto Sam with the Inkmoth Nexus.
Yeah, on the second thought, I actually do like leaving the Nexus around in the case if there's 2 removal spells, because you know that the Spell Bomb can tag the Ornithopter, and then you have another body to move those modular counters to.
See, Sam not going to go for Ensnaring Bridge just yet. He'll start with Pithing Needle.
Presumably naming Ravager. We'll get a check on that.
Yeah, that does stop that play where Michael can throw all his counters onto Ornithopter. Yeah, Arcbound Ravager was the name on Pithing Needle. And now that that's been named, here is Pyroclasm from Sam Black, taking care of both creatures.
Yeah, and you can't activate Inkmoth Nexus in response because it's just going to die to the Clasm itself.
So well played here by Sam Black. He has Belfatto clear of creatures, but Sam will take a second poison from the Inkmoth.
This is one of those games where both Galvanic Blast and Shrapnel Blast look less impressive. They combine a lot less well with Inkmoth Nexus than any other threat in the deck.
And with the creatures gone, it is time for Ensnaring Bridge from Sam. So Bridge down into play. Sam still has 2 cards remaining in his hand, so the Nexus can attack, at least for the time being.
Shouldn't take too long for that not to be true. I believe that Sam has a second Spell Bomb in hand. He's just leaving up mana to activate the first one right now, which makes sense.
Draw here from Belfatto, Arcbound Ravager. He'll play it. Now remember, Pithing Needle is still on Arcbound Ravager. Yeah, Sam could have shot Ravager with the Spell Bomb here, just opting not to. And here is the copy of Seagate Wreckage from Sam Black.
Yeah, Sam, with this many lands in play, it's Assuming that he does not draw 2 lands, you can reasonably assume that even drawing 2 cards a turn, he'll be able to be empty-handed at the end of any given turn. This helps him find more mill effects to actually close the game out faster.
Second spell bomb, and he is empty-handed now. So that'll put an end to attacks from Belfatto. He's going to have to find 15 points of burn. He has 8 in hand, however. The play is Master of Ethereum.
Yeah, Master is what? Is that currently a 3/3? I think there's a Citadel hanging out between the Glimmer Void and the Inkmoth Nexus. It can't attack.
It's not going to be able to attack anytime soon.
Right. Belfatto does not have any main deck ways to remove the bridge. He's really just relying on finding enough burn spells to actually just kill Sam.
So players will trade some draws back. Sam getting 2 cards per turn here with his Seagate Wreckage. And now Lantern of Insight. This is the first piece of the lock that's in play.
Yeah, and one of the abilities of Lantern of Insight you'll see is Sam knows that he doesn't necessarily want to draw the Thoughtseize, so he can also manipulate the top of his own deck. Kind of a build your own Sensei's Divining top.
He'll draw with Seagate Wreckage. And now Thoughtseize Belfatto. And this will force action.
Yeah, with the Glimmer Void and the Trap and the Mox Opal, Belfatto will be able to respond with both burn spells. And then the Thoughtseize is also going to do 2 damage to Sam, so this is kind of a big swing.
Yeah, this is 9 damage to Sam with burn, so Sam will go down to 6. Thoughtseize will still resolve. Sam will be at 4.
Now Belfatto has lethal just with any Galvanic Blast or the second Shrapnel Blast. So Sam's really going to be digging here for one of his milling effects. He really wants to get a Codex Shredder into play so he can start controlling the top of Belfatto's library.
Top library is now Vault Scourge. So Cranial Plating was the draw here for Belfatto. It will be difficult to attack. However, if he can get a Signal Pest down, there is a possibility that he can move this. You mentioned before that he can instant speed move this plating onto a creature.
Right, so now Sam has to be cautious of any red spell or any 0 power creatures. Ornithopter is another player here. Sam has an Infernal Tutor currently on the top of his deck. This is a card that for a long time was played exclusively in Legacy Storm.
Right.
Sam is planning on being Hellbent most of the time because he's a dedicated Ensnaring Bridge deck. So this is actually just Demonic Tutor in his deck.
Yeah, he only has 1 in the list, but it is very powerful.
Yeah, multiple copies is problematic because you can only use them to reveal the other copy.
Here's Vault Scourge from Belfatto. The top card is Signal Pest. Mentioned before that was one that Sam may have to watch out for.
And looks like there's a Ghoul Caller's Bell right on time. But yeah, I don't expect Sam to let Michael draw that card.
Yeah, here's Ghoul Caller's Bell.
To be fair, Sam still has 2 Pyrite spell bombs in play.
He'll Infernal Tutor. And we'll get to see what card 4 here.
So the game we're actually kind of playing here right now is the question of when Belfatto actually concedes the match. Or the game, rather.
Yeah, he has Sam to 4, so it's tempting not to, but you see Sam having Demonic Tutored for Codex Shredder here. Between Codex Shredder and Bell, it just doesn't seem likely that Michael will be able to draw that last Galvanic Blast.
Right, you have 2 mill effects, and then Lantern of Insight itself has the ability to sacrifice to make target player shuffles its library. So if you happen to find any of those other 3 Galvanic Blasts and Shrapnel Blasts, they have to be right on top of each other in the deck for it to even be a problem. And even then, Sam has outs.
Now, he does have 4 Galvanic Blasts, so in theory, 3 of them could stack up.
Right, and the second Shrapnel Blast as well. The odds are quite slim and only getting slimmer. And here we see the concession.
Yeah, Michael Belfatto will go ahead and let that one go. So he has Sam down to 4, but not able to get the rest of the game. Sam Black with Lantern Control up 1 game to 0.
And that's what this Lantern deck really does. It gets your hopes up that maybe you're going to win a game, but Sam Black is certainly not a stranger to winning games on 5 or less life with this deck.
A really fascinating one. So we're going to go ahead and look at the sideboards for each player. Michael Belfatto, starting out in Affinity, he has a copy of Blood Moon, 2 Ancient Grudges, 2 Spellskites, 2 Gear per Aether Grids, 2 Wear Tears, 2 Doomblades, and 2 Whip Flares. It's actually a lot of game here for the Affinity player.
Yeah, the Ancient Grudge is huge actually against both of these decks, so having that in your sideboard for either player would be great. So Belfatto has them, those will surely be coming in. The Wear Tear is also just a one-time shatter effect, but it's still good. You want to knock out every bridge that enters play. Gearapprover Aether Grid is interesting. You'd consider bringing that one in just because it enables you to deal damage outside of combat. Generally, it's reserved just for killing opponent's creatures, but a little bit of reach is actually worth considering in this matchup. I wouldn't be surprised if we stuck to just Grudge and Wear Tear, but it's an option.
Sure. How do you feel about something like Spell Pierce here? I know that Sam empties his hand very early on, but a turn on Spell Pierce might be able to do some damage.
I have two concerns with Spell Pierce. The first is that you have to catch him in the early game with it to counter anything and make it matter and be able to actually counter a spell. The other is with Affinity. In general, the rule is that you want to do as light sideboarding as possible. Your deck is an engine that's based on having a small number of payoff cards and a whole lot of air. So the more you do sideboard-wise, the more you end up with hands that are just non-functional, even when you have your great sideboard card.
And on Sam's side of the board, he has additional copies of many of his locked pieces. Ancient Grudge, Welding Jar, Spellskite, Leyline of Sanctity, Sun Droplet, Nature's Claim, Grafdigger's Cage, Pithing Needle, Surgical Extraction. What do we like against Affinity?
Yeah, so we have an Ancient Grudge mirror going on here. So Sam should be bringing in Ancient Grudge as well. Welding Jar is a consideration just because you want to protect your bridge. You can probably assume that any Affinity deck is going to have Ancient Grudge in its sideboard. That's pretty stock. The Pithing Needle, we saw it be cast to some reasonable effect in Game 1. It's possibly bring that in against Affinity. It shuts off Cranial Plating, shuts off Arcbound Ravager. I think that this matchup is probably not the right matchup for Sun Droplet, so I don't expect that one to come in.
Well, they normally board that one in against Burn.
Right, exactly. Affinity is capable of dealing 10 points in one turn, so Sun Droplet is considerably less effective in that kind of situation. And then Nature's Claim is, on the same lines of Michael bringing in Wear Tear. It's just a good one for one.
Yeah, Aaron Rule saw that we'll take care of any Affinity's cards. Certainly seems reasonable here. For those of you joining us, we're just starting here on round 1 of 15 here from the Modern Open from SCG Louisville. This is one of the events on our Season 1 SCG Tour. You see, we are working our way toward our Season 1 Invitational in Columbus. That's going to be in just under 2 months. We have our Louisville Modern Open. Next week we'll be in Philadelphia. Then we take a break, but we will have some standard events in Indianapolis and Baltimore before we make our way to Columbus. So a lot of chances here still to qualify if you haven't.
Absolutely. Legacy next weekend should be pretty exciting. Don't get a lot of Legacy tournaments these days. I know I'll be happy to watch that one. I believe that Boswell and CVM will be back in the booth for that, so it should be a good show.
Yeah, I mean, and if you can't make it out to one of these events and still want to qualify for the Invitational, we do have Star City Games IQs happening all over the country each weekend. Actually, my first chance to play in an IQ the first time in almost a year last weekend at Regionals.
Yeah, I believe that that went pretty well for you.
I played in the finals. I did not take the invitation because we're going to be casting the event, so that seemed like a little pointless. But
absolutely, yeah. I believe your finals opponent was a reasonably well-known Minnesota player. One of the up-and-coming grinders in the area.
Yeah, I played also a judge in there, Nikolai Tuthill, in the finals. But it was my first thing playing in the top 4, my first experience of playing against Eldrazi, and boy, was that an awakening. I fortunately he mulled to 5. He still put me to 1 life. So, that was great. That was geez. That's when we realized that something was up.
Yeah, I played Eldrazi last weekend, and the worst keep that I made the entire tournament was one time I kept a 7-card hand that didn't have an Ayabugan or an Eldrazi Temple. Learned real fast that was a mistake, and won a lot of games after mulliganing to 5.
Sam down to 6 cards here for game 2. Lantern Control is actually a deck that mulligans fairly frequently, but mulligans well as it's a prison deck.
It's very redundant, and also sometimes just mulliganing makes your ensnaring bridge just come online faster.
I was thinking that too. It's like, well, one way to get rid of all the cards in your hand.
To be fair, post-sideboard, when your opponent has Ancient Grudge, that does make the mulligan a little bit more punishing. So if Belfatto draws one of those, that could be extremely relevant here.
Yeah, your Ancient Bridge Lock is nowhere. Your Ensnaring Bridge Lock is nowhere near as robust when Ancient Grudge is in your opponent's deck.
Right. Sam, does he have Academy Ruins hanging out here? He does. He has 2 copies of Academy Ruins in his deck, so he does have the ability to, over a long enough timeline, continue to cast Ensnaring Bridge. though Affinity can be pretty punishing if that's your line.
Signal Pest does a start for Belfatto. For Sam, it's a copy of Lantern of Insight, and immediately he shows one of his sideboard cards. Ancient Grudge will be the next draw for Sam.
In fact, his best sideboard card. Probably pretty happy to have that one on top.
We'll see Belfatto. Glimmervoid is the play. Looks like it'll be a Hangerback Walker on 1, and he will pass back to Sam.
Hangerback Walker is a bit more resilient against Ancient Grudge than other cards in Belfatto's deck, and a lot of players actually just put Hangerback Walker exclusively in the Affinity sideboard. Belfatto has him in the main deck, and it's definitely a reasonable choice, especially with those Arcbound Workers like we discussed earlier.
Looking at Sam's hand, he has a Pithing Needle, a Pyrite, Spellbomb, an Ancient Grudge, a pair of lands. Has removal and mana, but outside of the Lantern, it doesn't have any of his lock pieces.
Yeah, Sam has a Glimmervoid that he could play here, which gives him access to Ancient Grudge, but something to be concerned about is Belfatto's own artifact hate. If you just played Glimmervoid and left up Ancient Grudge, and Belfatto just destroyed your Lantern, then you would also get Stone Rain in the process.
Well, I'll correct myself. He does have one of the lock pieces. Sam plays Pithing Needle, and then the last card there was Pixis of Pandemonium. So this is a Ghoulcaller Bell style effect to tap. So instead of milling each player for 1, it exiles both players for 1, which is...
It exiles face down, which is kind of a wild element. Obviously, the cards on the top of the libraries are face up, but it is something that adds kind of a weird, wacky, random element to games sometimes.
Yeah, no, this one's used frequently to mill players off of Eldrazi or cards with flashback.
Yeah, because you exile the card instead of putting it into their graveyard. And I think that Sam is actually just playing it as a 9th Bell. I believe that's the count. Yes, he has 1 copy of Pixis in addition to the 4 Bells and the 4 Shredders. Of course, he can always Infernal Tutor for it when the actual milling is relevant.
Arcbound Ravager will be the play from Belfatto. The Pithing Needle that was played by Sam Black did name Hangerback Walker next turn.
Yeah, that's a typical strategy with Pithing Needle, is just to name the card that's already in play, though the Ravager is probably going to be more punishing here.
Belfatto will play Ravager and Arcbound Worker. Immediately sack the Worker to put a counter on Ravager and a counter onto Hangerback Walker.
It's what we call a combo in the game. The interaction between Modular and Arcbound Ravager is quite powerful. Usually you only see it come up when somebody actually draws 2 Arcbound Ravagers, but that Modular ability is going to allow him to put a counter on both the Ravager and the Walker, which is quite powerful.
Sam will go ahead and tap the Pixis. Looks like he will draw Ancient Stirrings. Arcbound Ravager waits on top of Belfatto's deck. Feels like we are in a race for Sam to get his way to an Ensnaring Bridge.
Yeah, that's exactly what he needs to find right here. He's on 18, which looks like a high life total, but then Belfatto has 4 power and a Signal Pest, so it's 6 on just attacking with these creatures he has in play. And still 2 cards in hand, and Affinity has some high impact ones in the deck, so definitely a lot for Sam to be thinking about right here. Does still have that Ancient Grudge.
And here is Ancient Stirrings for Sam. We know Mox Opal on the top of the deck. See what else he has a shot at. Looks like it has a set of lands and Mox Opal is what he can go for.
Yeah, he can take his pick of mana source here.
It's going to be the Opal. That will give him the red mana to start for Ancient Grudge.
Yep, Needle, Lantern, Opal. He's got Metalcraft going. Also, it makes sense to get an artifact mana source over a land when he has Glimmervoid in hand in case things just go horribly wrong here.
Yeah, he wouldn't want if Belfatto draws a Grudge of his own.
Right.
But how does Sam keep his life total high? That's going to be the challenge here. Looks like he's going to start with Ancient Grudge. That'll be on Arcbound Ravager.
Yeah, so Belfatto has some options. Looks like he's sacrificing the Hangerback Walker, and this will give him some top tier tokens and some options on where he's going to put those Ravager counters.
So, Hangerback Walker sacrificed to Arcbound Ravager. And then the counters moved over to Signal Pest, but Sam will go ahead and Ancient Grudge there too.
Yep, and it makes a lot of sense to put the counters on the Signal Pest instead of a Thopter token, because when the Grudge happens, then you're taking care of the 0 power creature with counters instead of the 1 power creature with counters. You assume that Sam's going to have more answers to the other Thopter. If you get left with Signal Pest as your last creature, you just can't attack at all.
Now, I want to go back to that play. So if Michael wanted his Hangerback Walker to crack, it feels like what he could have done is, in response to the first Ancient Grudge, he could have sacrificed the Ravager to try to attempt to move 2 1/1 counters to Hangerback Walker. Sam would have been forced to then respond to...
That's true.
Yeah, and then he would have had a 4/4 Hangerback Walker. And then Sam could have grudged it, but he would have gotten 4 tokens, and the Signal Pest would still be alive.
Yeah, he would be left with 2 tokens and the Signal Pest, which is better than 2 tokens and no Signal Pest, so yeah.
Well, actually more than 2, because with that Ancient Grudge on the stack, Sam
Sam
flash
didn't have
it back.
the mana source in play at that time, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah, then that plays a lot better considering that, and arguably a misstep by Sam.
Well, the Grudge would still be on the stack, so Sam couldn't even flash it back yet.
Right.
So, but yeah, nonetheless, I think Belfatto could have come out of here with 4 Thopters instead of 2. Okay, going back though, Belfatto follows up with a Signal Pest to try to pump the Thopter tokens. Sam is at the ready with that Pyrite Spellbomb, shooting down Signal Pest, so he's keeping the board relatively clear, but still taking 2 damage a turn off these Thopters.
Right.
Swing for 2 will put Sam down to 13. Now we'll see whether or not Sam lets Belfatto keep that Shrapnel Blast.
I'm inclined to believe that he will not.
Yeah, it is a burn game going on here from Belfatto's side. And here's the Ensnaring Bridge, Sam finding it off an Ancient Stirring, so another piece getting at the ready.
And with those Signal Pests out of the picture, this is going to brick all of Belfatto's creatures in short order. Pyroclasm hanging out on top of the deck to boot, though I think Pixis is probably going to remove that one from play.
Yeah, well, Sam just has to decide if he actually needs the Pyroclasm, and it looks like he doesn't. He'll go ahead and mill. Gets rid of the Shrapnel Blast, mills Belfatto to a Galvanic Blast. Not a great improvement here.
No, that saves 1 life, but the sacrifice of the artifact, not super relevant here.
Well, 1 poison and 2 creatures attack. Sam will go to 11. Belfatto has him at a virtual 7, but we're getting to that point where Belfatto's ability to deal damage is really compromised.
Yep. Sam will be drawing up to 2 cards, and they're both cards he can cast, so he's going to be hell-bent at the end of this turn, which will turn off any attacks from Belfatto.
And here's another Lantern of Insight. And another Pithing Needle. See what out Sam wants to name here. The first one's already on Hangerback Walker from earlier in the game.
Yeah, he's probably just going into the tank. There's no name that's actually extremely relevant. I would probably pick Cranial Plating here, because in some oddball, bizarre, it sounds like Sam did in fact name Plating. There's like this weird sequence of draws where Belfatto could end up with a 0 power creature and a Cranial Plating.
Yeah, and if he gets even 1 hit off that kind of line, that's enough to win the game.
Right.
So Cranial Plating turned off. Belfatto will cast Hangerback Walker on 2. But Hangerback Walker's needled. And Ensnaring Bridge is in play, so these creatures just don't seem to matter very much.
Yeah, he's got nothing better to do than just cast them, but they're not going to do anything in play.
Pithing Needle number 3 for Sam. This one's on Arcbound Ravager.
Yeah, just name the other cards that you can name at this point.
Well, this is another thing where he wants to take away Michael's ability to put power onto a 0 power creature at instant speed.
Right. You would be able to get 1 hit in with some Ravager tricks.
Third Lantern of Insight. Now, these extra lanterns are actually relevant because they have a one-shot ability to make a player shuffle their library.
Right. Getting increasingly less likely that Belfatto has any live draws in his deck, and there's also just the fact that Sam can make him shuffle them away.
Now we just play this game where both players will just draw cards for most turns. When you watch a really good Lantern pilot, what you'll notice a lot of the time is, though they have the option to mill their opponents, they frequently don't.
Yeah, and the game plan is not to mill them as fast as possible because you have inevitability. You have access to Academy Ruins. You will never deck yourself. So the impact of these milling effects, these targeting one card at a time milling effects, is just to control your opponent's draw step. Inevitably, you will win this game. And we're not going to see Belfatto concede, even though he's like probably just hard locked out of this game at this point because, you know, he's down in a game and you may as well fight it out. Though at some point, you know, going and get a donut and some coffee becomes appealing, or just getting out of this horrible grind.
Yeah, you see Sam there milling away the Galvanic Blast. There is an Ancient Grudge next.
Here we see the relevance of the Pixis again, because Sam's just going to remove that from the game, and you can't flash it back when it's exiled.
And he gets a Welding Jar that will give him an insurance against any sort of removal. Now, this is a nice play. So what Sam did is he wanted to be sure to get that Ancient Grudge, but he did not want to exile his own Codex Shredder. So he used Academy Ruins main phase to put that Pirate Spellbomb on top of his deck so that he could tap Pixis and not exile his own Codex Shredder.
This is not Sam's first rodeo with the deck. I will stress that this deck is extremely complex. It was actually left out of the Pro Tour Gauntlet for that reason. There's a lot of lines like that that are far from immediately obvious.
So it wasn't left out of the Gauntlet for competitive reasons? It was just for playability reasons?
Yeah, it just, if you wanted to learn about Modern and you got stuck with this deck, you would probably just lose and in games that were easily winnable.
Things are getting closer and closer for Michael. Gear per Aether Grid is on top. That's another one that Sam's going to have to mill, but because that Codex Shredder he got last turn, he has up to 4 mills to control Michael's draw here. He can do it on end step and then do it again main phase.
Yeah. To put it lightly, Michael is in trouble. Saw Sam mill himself with the Shredder there. He just wants to find that business and get this game closed out.
Well, he's just looking for more copies of Codex Shredder, basically.
Right. He knows that Michael has that Galvanic Blast in hand, and letting him draw 2 more of that effect is going to be game over.
So you see how Sam got rid of the Aether Grid. Now he's getting rid of Shrapnel Blast. Arcbound Ravager, the top card. Imagine Sam's okay letting him draw that, especially because there's a Pithing Needle on Arcbound Ravager.
Right. It would take Ravager, 0-power creature, and a way to destroy the needle to make that matter.
So let's go back a bit here, because I think Sam has this one more or less locked up. People have talked about Lantern control because of the fact that Ensnaring Bridge is one of the best ways to fight against Eldrazi right now.
Right. That's the reason, like, Sam played it at the Pro Tour. I don't know if that was necessarily guided by knowledge of Eldrazi. I think that he actually just liked this deck for a long time.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he knew about Eldrazi. His team was aware of the deck.
Right, yeah. Sam is definitely in tune with the competitive community, so he was certainly aware of it. And it was a fine choice even before the Eldrazi deck existed. But it's absolutely true that Ensnaring Bridge is one of those cards that people are playing because you're very unlikely to be able to attack with a Reality Smasher when there's an Ensnaring Bridge in play.
Yeah, now out of the blue-red or blue-white versions of Eldrazi, they don't actually have too many ways to deal with Ensnaring Bridge.
Yeah, and in the main deck, there's not going to be anything. You just have to commit your deck to being a bunch of Eldrazi, and they typically go with some Dismembers, and you do see some number of Ratchet Bomb in the main deck for a lot of these Eldrazi decks, which is an answer to Ensnaring Bridge, though it's not exactly a clean answer. Something that's interesting about Sam's deck is when you go into sideboard games and you know that their answer is just going to be Ratchet Bomb, you can plan to Ancient Grudge it before it gets to 3.
Right, or you can needle it.
Right, absolutely.
A lot of things. Now, one thing I have seen, which I'll be interested about, we talked about how there's so many different flavors of Eldrazi. One thing we've actually seen as kind of a response to maybe the Worships, the Ensnaring Bridges of the format, is the green-red Eldrazi deck, which is the same color shell, but it plays Ancient Stirrings, Kozilek's Return, and World Breaker. 4 World Breakers actually gives you a lot of game against something like Ensnaring Bridge.
Absolutely. Any non-creature permanent, you exile it, so Sam would not be able to Academy Ruins a bridge back against a World Breaker. We saw Belfatto concede this game here. That's where we're going. Sam Black picks this one up 2-0. Doesn't actually have to close most of his games with this deck.
Yeah, so Sam Black will get this one with Lantern Control into. And